This is the video for 2/9%. There's no vocabulary, however, prior to watching this video, I did ask you to go ahead and review what you remember about the percent formula from last year or the percent equation. And most of you probably put part over whole equals percent over 100. And that is one way to do it, but I'm also in this video going to show you another way to do it. The one way that I don't want you to do it is to think of it as is over of. And the reason is because that can be a little confusing based on the wording of the questions. So I don't want you to think of it that way. I want you to think of it as part over whole. Okay, so let's go over the first example. What percent of 56 is 42? And so my part is 42 and my whole is 56. And I'm trying to find my percent. So part over whole equals percent over 100. And so then how do I solve this? I use the cross product property. And when I do so, I get 75%. Okay, so go ahead and hit pause and work out the on your own. What percent of 90 is 54? What percent of 90 is 54? So 54 is my part and 90 is my whole. So again, I use the cross product property and I say 5,400 divided by 90 is 60%. And this is the way you probably learned it, and if you're comfortable with this way, that's absolutely fine. This way can get a little confusing if you're having trouble identifying what's the part and what's the whole. Because remember, the part is not always the smallest number. So I'm going to show you another way. And if you don't like this way, you don't have to use it. But this is the part you have to remember. If you see the word what, that's your variable. If you see the word is, that means equals. And if you see the word of, that means multiplication. What is your variable? Is means equals, and of means multiplication. So knowing that now, let's look at this. What percent is your variable? Of is multiplication. 40 is means equals 2.5. Let me read that 2 again. What percent of 40 is 2.5? And so then I just solve by dividing both sides by 40. And when I do so, I get 0.0625. But here's the thing. When you're doing it this way, it always gives you your percent expressed as a decimal. So that means you're going to have to multiply it by 100 in order to put it in percent form. But otherwise, this way may be easier for you if you have trouble identifying what's the part and what's the whole. Okay, so let's go ahead and pause the video and do this on your own. What percent of 84 is 63? And go ahead and do it the way I just showed you, at least this once, so then you would have done it both ways, and then you can decide which way is easiest for you. Okay, so it says what percent of 84 is 63? What percent my variable, what means X, my variable. What percent is my variable of is multiplication, 84 is means equals 63. What percent of 84 is 63? And so then how do I do that? I just divide both sides by 84. And I get 0.75. So then I have to multiply it by 100 in order to put it in percent form, because when I do it this way, it always gives me my percent expressed as a decimal. Okay, so let's look at the next example, and at this point, you can solve this any way you want, either way. A shirt that originally cost $38.50 is 30% off. What's the sale price? So you have to think, what's the question I'm asking myself? You're saying, what is 30% of $38.50? Now that's going to give you your discount. And once you figure out that answer, if you subtract it from the original cost, you'll get your sale price. Another way to do this is to think of it this way. This is going to give me my discount. But if you want to know the total cost paid quicker than subtracting the discount, you can think of it this way. If the shirt was originally 30% off, that means I paid for 70% of that shirt. So then a better question to ask myself could be this. Well, what is 70% of $38.50? Because that will tell me the total that will tell me the total amount I paid. Because my discount was 30%, that means I paid 70% of the original cost. So now let me think of my equation here. I say, what is 70%, my percent expressed as a decimal, of $38.50? And when I do so, I get $26.95. And that's how much I paid for the shirt. If you wanted to set it up as part over whole, your whole was $38.50. You're missing your part, and you paid for 70% of that shirt. Okay, so let's look at your example here. You're on your own. You buy a car for $9,000 and you eventually sell it for 60% less than what you paid. How much did you sell it for? Okay, so let me work it out for you. You buy a car for $9,000 and you eventually sell it for 60% less. So again, there's two ways to do this. I can figure out, well, what is 60% of $9,000? And then I can subtract that from the $9,000. And that's fine. You can do it that way. Or you can think of it this way. If I sold it for 60% less, that means I sold it for 40% of what I paid for it. So my question I can ask myself is, what is 40% of $9,000? Because I sold it for 40% of what I paid for it. What is 40% of $9,000 and $3,600? You sold it for $3,600. Okay, last example. Okay, 125. Percent expressed as a decimal. 125% of what number is 17.5? 125% of what number is 17.5? And so then how do I solve that? I go ahead and divide both sides by 1.25, and when I do that I get 14. Another way you could set that up is 125% of what number is 17.5? I know my part, but I'm missing my whole. Okay, so work out the last on your own. 30% of what number is 12.5? Okay, 30% expressed as a decimal of what number is 12.5? And so then let me just read that one more time so you see it. 30% of what number is 12.5? And so then I divide both sides by 0.30. And when I do that, I get about 41.7 approximately. Another way I can do that, 30% of what number? There's my 30%. Of what number is 12.5? So I have my part and I'm missing my whole. Okay, so go ahead and do your practice problems, and again, you can go ahead and solve these any way you want, whichever way you feel more comfortable.